All right, so the most dramatic year in golf continues, and this time it's Pat Perez, never one not to speak his mind, but he was with Claude Harmon on Claude's podcast, Son of a Butch podcast, and he really went in hard on Phil Mickelson, especially going to that point, we're not talking about dislike, like saying his hatred, like talking about his hatred for Phil is something really strong. So let's just dissect this really quick. We're going to first start with what he said. So on the show, he said, when it comes to Phil, I have a different hate for Phil than most people. People won't know the story. I'm not going to go into the story again, but Phil crossed the line with me. That is just uncrossable and unforgivable. So he's saying, using a lot of strong wording there, hate, a different kind of hate, uncrossable line, unforgivable. We're going to speculate in a second about what we think he's talking about here. But if you really dissect this quote, there's something in there that makes me feel like maybe there's something that went on behind closed doors or something that we're not privy to, because he said, people won't know the story. So to me, if you're referring to what we all think you're referring to and Phil's comments about Liv early on in its stages, you would think you'd say something like people all know the story. But he says people won't know the story. I'm not going to go into the story again. So not 100% certain if it was something maybe that Phil said or did directly to Pat that he's alluding to here. But he goes on to say he, meaning Phil, knows that he screwed up. He apologized for the accident, but I cannot forgive him for it because I've known Phil for a long, long time. I've known the guy forever. So here again, we're hearing that he's saying that it's something, a line that should not have been crossed was crossed with Pat, and it was unforgivable. One thing that has to be concerning is, given the smaller fields in live golf in general, now you've got two guys in that live arena that are fighting and fighting this, publicly. I don't know if we'll have to see whether that ends up being an issue for Liv. I mean, also you could say no press is bad press. This has been all over the headlines over the last 24 hours. So it's brought a lot more of attention to Liv, but going in and like trying to speculate, what was he talking about? And partially it makes me wonder two things. One, it was known, and on the podcast, I would encourage you to go and listen to the full podcast with when he's speaking to Claude. One thing that he kind of goes into and he talks about is the early days when Phil was one of the first names to start going over to Liv, and he was doing a lot of behind the scenes recruiting of players. Now, there are people who are going to say and could speculate that part of that was that Pat might have been left out of that early on. Maybe Pat wasn't approached by Phil early on. Remember, Pat originally was one of those guys who was saying he wasn't going to Live, and then later on got the big number and decided to make the move. And since it's been incredibly lucrative for him, we'll talk about that more in just a second. It could have been, was there a little bit of jealousy on Pat's side where he wasn't getting initially recruited by Phil? But he goes in and in a spot almost agrees with Phil a little bit and Phil's original position of some of the gripes with the PGA Tour. He said Phil is 100% correct in the way that the tour is the way they are. They are for themselves. They are not for the players. They are not for growing anybody except their own pockets. So here Phil is saying, I agree with Phil in his position about the PGA Tour. And he even, again, as I said earlier, Pat Perez, not one to pull any punches. He really goes after the PGA Tour again here. He says they call themselves a non-profit organization, yet all they have is profit. So how does that work? The thing about what I was saying is Phil almost ruined the thing completely because of his comments about the deal. And he says, by what he means about Phil almost ruining it, he said, the guys got scared and were like, well, this isn't going to work now. Phil's obviously turned. He's saying that in this. I couldn't have been worse timing for the Live group in that deal. And what he's referring to there are Phil's comments that came out early in the year talking about the Saudis being, quote, bad MFers. I'm not going to say the whole thing here, but when he said that, it caused a lot of the media blitz that happened around it. to really go in. And that's where Phil went dark for a while. He did issue that apology, and that was a whole thing too. If you go back, and a lot of people said that the apology didn't feel genuine. It felt like more like Phil was defending his position. But what I'm wondering is this what Pat was referring to? Now, full well knowing that Pat ended up making the jump to live. It's been incredibly lucrative for him. He made more money this year than he's made in many previous years. I think it was about $8 million. So is that line that was crossed and uncrossable Phil's approach and what he said specifically about Liv, and where it almost killed the entire tour because of the bad press and publicity that it brought? That's what's really hard to find out. He goes on, he says, but the whole thing about me wearing out Phil has way more to do with the interaction or problem we had, as opposed to him trying to beat up the tour and going after a lot of money. That's what needs to be clarified. So when I see a quote like that, it makes me feel like something else happened. Something happened behind the scenes. Something was said, and Pat is in a roundabout way trying to clarify and saying it's not about the tour, it's not about Liv, it's about something else, some sort of line. And him saying that he has known Phil for a long time, and as part of that, because they were good friends or acquaintances prior to this, it was uncrossable and unforgivable whatever atrocity Phil has committed to Pat. So whether we'll get that full story or not remains to be seen. But Pat Perez, he's a guy right now who's kind of living his best life. He's made more money than ever on Liv. And the other big news that came out of that interview was Pat sharing that a number of PGA Tour players, he named and called out specifically Justin Thomas, I think he also referred to Jon Rahm, had sent him congratulatory notes on his season on Liv. And that's where Pat is saying, he unapologetically saying, like, look, I'm 46 years old. I was never going to make that kind of money on the PGA Tour. It was a no-brainer for me to go over to Liv. He's gotten a lot of heat and people poking fun at him for his performance as related to how much he's made. It's not been his highest performing year, but being part of the team aspect has earned him a whole lot of money. He's basically saying that something that we are not seeing, which is PGA Tour players reaching out and congratulating him, makes it feel like, hey, maybe there's not as much animosity behind the scenes between the Liv guys and the PGA Tour guys. But regardless, the big story here is no doubt the headline making of Pat saying and really going in fully on Phil Mickelson saying this hatred. So we're going to have to see if more comes out after this. But for right now, like I said, go check out the Son of a Butch podcast, hear his full comments, but he talks about his long-term hate. And when we see that word hate being used, it's very strong. It almost feels like these two guys couldn't even be in the same room right now, which what will that spell for Liv going forward? The team aspect, that type of thing. We all know that they've got a lot of these, like the parties that happen before the Liv events, after they often travel together. How does that look with Phil and Pat? How's that going to look going to next season? Is this a problem for Liv, or does it just give them more headlines and more attention? A lot remains to be seen, but big bombs of quotes being dropped by Pat Perez, and it's got the whole internet buzzing this week. So let us know what you guys think in the comments. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll definitely get into this more as more news comes out.